So let's talk about the spacing. As you can see, if you scroll down in Token Studio plugin in the other tab, you can see the spacing settings area. Once I click on the spacing, I can see different categories for spacing. We have the standard spacing for standard elements on our Figma project file. We also have the section spacing and something that we like to call contextual spacing. We'll go over each other spacing settings in this video. You also may have noticed that we have the spacing area above. That's where the ACSS tokens, something similar to utility classes that you have in ACSS, is located. But first, let's go over the spacing settings in the other tab, because that's the place where we want to make changes to adjust our spacing. So right now we are located in the spacing style guide page. And in this style guide page, it gives us the preview of all the spacing values. So here you can see we have basic element spacing. This is a preview for the desktop. And on the right, we have a preview for the mobile. Down below, we can see the section spacing. That's related to sections. Section is an element that comes automatically with a spacing related to section by default. So we have a section gather, for example, that's horizontal, left and right padding values. And we also have other section spacing values here. Now it's the same as with the basic element spacing on top. So we have the preview on the left for the desktop, and on the right we have a preview for the mobile devices. Now, how do I actually go and change the spacing values for basic element spacing and section spacing? Well, we need to scroll in the other tab in Token Studio plugin and search for spacing. Let's expand the standard spacing. What options do we have? We can see we have SM base spacing, SD base spacing, SM spacing scale, and SD spacing scale. What that means is that we have two categories of spacing. We have the base spacing and we have spacing scale. And both of those categories are available for desktop and mobile devices. Now it's very similar to what we had in our previous video with the headings. When we wanted to adjust the heading font sizes, we needed to adjust heading base size. And then we also could adjust the headings type scale. So the base spacing values are related to space M token. That's our base spacing token. As you can see here, if I hover over the SD base spacing, the value of this token is 30. And here in our preview, in our style guide page, you can see that the space M is 30 pixels for the desktop variation, of course. If we hover over the SM base spacing, which is the same token but it's related to the mobile device, the tooltip says that the value is 24 pixels. And we can make sure that it is 24 pixels by looking at here. So we have space M for the mobile device and it is an actual value of 24 pixels. So let me give you an example of how you can change the spacing values for desktop. In Token Studio plugin in the other tab, I can locate the SD base spacing token, right click and edit token, or use a keyboard shortcut Command plus left click or Control plus left click if you are using Windows. And then you can just simply adjust the value to whatever you like. Let's just say that we want to go from 30 pixels to something like 45 pixels. If I click on save, you can see that all of my spacing values are changed. You can see that the both textual value and the visual representation of that value both automatically changed. Now let's revert back to our 30 pixels and pay close attention to these values here, and as well as a visual representation on the right side right here. Click on save and you can see how it all changed. Besides changing the base spacing value, we can also change the actual spacing scale for each specific spacing token. So as I said earlier, as it was very similar with a typography heading token, for example, where we had a chance to change the type scale, we can change the spacing scale from right now it's 1.5 by default. And that means that, for example, this space L token is 1.5 times bigger than the space M token. If I change the value from 1.5 to, for example, a value of 2, click on save, you can see that the space L ACSS spacing token is right now 2 times bigger as the space M spacing token. I'm going to revert the value back to 1.5. And again, you can see how everything adjusts by itself, automatically, without you having to manually enter values for each specific spacing token. Everything that I've done for the desktop here, you can also do for the mobile version as well. Now let's go to section spacing. I will close the standard spacing in the Token Studio plugin, and I'll open the section spacing settings area. Here you can see that we have 4 different ACSS spacing tokens, but it's the same as with the previous standard spacing, where we only had 2 categories divided into 2 devices. That is for the desktop and for the mobile as well. So actually, we only have the spacing multiplier and a section gather settings. So what's spacing multiplier? Well, by default, we are multiplying the space M token, and we are using that value as a default value for section space M token. So if we hover over the SD base spacing multiplier, its value is 4. And in the description, you can actually read that it sets the base multiplier value for section spacing on the desktop. So again, if you look at the above, you can see that the space M spacing ACSS token is equal to 30 pixels. 30 pixels times 4, because that's the value of the base spacing multiplier, is equal to 120 pixels, just as you can see here. And that gives you a sense of how you can change the section spacing. Because if you want to adjust the section spacing, you can simply change the spacing multiplier. So for example, let's just say that I would like to make it a little bit bigger. So what I have to do is, in the spacing multiplier for the desktop, let's just change the value from 4 to 5. Click on save. And right now you can see that all of my section spacing regarding the desktop version of it are a little bit bigger. Alright, you can see it in the values and also in the visual representation of it. If I revert its value back from 5 to 4 and click on save, you can see that it got a little bit smaller. You also may have noticed that once I changed the spacing scale for basic element spacing, it also affected the section spacing, because you can actually see that we have a spacing scale 1.5 here, but we can also see it here in the section spacing. So let's have a look. If I adjust spacing scale on desktop from 1.5 to, for example, 3, pay close attention to what happens in this section spacing area. I click on save, and you can see that not only it affected the basic element spacing, it also affected a section spacing. I'll revert back its value from 3 to 1.5. And again, pay close attention to what happens in this section spacing area. I will click on save, and you can see how everything got a little bit smaller. The only thing that is not automated in this spacing settings is the section gather. What's section gather? Well, section gather is horizontal spacing that we are using on the left and the right side. Basically, it's the padding for the section. I will give you an example. I will hide the Token Studio plugin, and in our Frames for Figma file, we have a utility component called section component. We'll get to that later, but just for now, for demonstration purposes, if I press Shift+I to open up the contextual menu in the Figma, and I will click on Components and search for a section component. I'll drag it in. So you can see that it automatically comes by default with an outer wrapper and an inner container. As you can see, the side padding is 60 pixels. That stands for horizontal padding. And the top and the bottom, which means the vertical padding, is set to 120 pixels. That's because a section component by default comes with some tokens applied. And I can check that by going to the Token Studio plugin Inspect tab. And you can see that we have some padding top, right, bottom, and the left values applied. And for the padding right and the padding left values, we see a D section gather token that's been applied. So that is the section gather. It's the horizontal spacing we have on the left and on the right side. So I'm going to remove the section component for now. I'll go back to Token Studio plugin. And that was just to show you that what section gather means. If you want to adjust its value, you can just simply left click the token with the command key on your keyboard selected, and you can manually change this value from 60, which comes by default, to something else you like. I'm going to hit cancel and I'm going to explain to you the contextual spacing values here. So we like to use contextual spacing values and names because it gives the users a little bit more hint on where to use the spacing. We have something called container gap, we have the content gap, and we also have a grid gap. And we also have all of those three setting values for the mobile version as well. I think you are pretty aware of what those contextual spacing values means from ACSS WordPress plugin, but if you're not, let me give you a quick glimpse of what it means. If I go back and paste in the section component again, you can see that it also automatically comes with this gap between inner container elements of 68 pixels. What this is, if I go to Inspect tab, it's this item spacing value. It's the gap between the elements in the container. So if I would have, right now I have only one inner container. Let's give it a fill value of primary color. Perfect. I'm going to duplicate this section and notice there is a gap between the inner containers. I'm going to select the outer section component, and that gap, this one here, is this 68 pixels. If I'm going to remove that, you can actually see that both of those inner containers are touching each other's. Now, here's a good time to give you a little tip. If I go to Inspect tab, you can still see that there is an item spacing, which means item spacing in Token Studio plugin means there is a spacing token applied as a gap value. That's what it means. But I manually deleted its value from here. Now, anytime I go to Token Studio plugin and I click Apply to the page, you can actually see that the gap reappears. And that's because Token Studio plugin takes precedence over any manually overwritten changes you have made in your Figma file, in the design panel, that is. So if I actually want to change this value from 68 pixels to something else, I can either go in my Token Studio plugin and search for any spacing token, or I can delete the actual container gap. And how can I do that? Well, I can simply go to the Inspect tab and I can remove this token. Once I remove it, you can see that the gap is close to 0. So that's just a little tip of how to be careful with overriding your design layouts in Figma design panel. You always want to use Token Studio plugin to make design decisions. So I'm going to remove the section component again, and I'm going to revert back to our content gap and grid gap. Now the content gap is used by regular elements in your design. So let's just say that you would have a basic card element with a photo, name, and a author description. So the actual gap between those elements would be a content gap. And a grid gap, just as the name suggests, it's used for your grids on your website. So let's just say you would have a media library with, 12 photos, for example. And let's just say that you would like to apply some gap between those images. Well, what you want to use is a grid gap. It's not a rule that you have to use it. It's just for some design decisions and making better choices overall. So that's for the actual spacing settings and how you can change spacing values. And in the upcoming video, we're going to have a look at how you can apply the spacing values.